In 1978, General Motors made one of the biggest changes in its late 20th century lineup when it downsized its intermediate cars, the so-called A-bodies, just 1 year after shrinking its full-size models. The goal was obvious: make the cars lighter, shorter, and more fuel-efficient at a time when high gas prices and tightening fuel economy rules were reshaping the entire American auto industry. But while the new cars were smaller and more efficient, they also came with compromises. Build quality wasn't always impressive. The materials weren't as rich as before, and in some cases, the styling lost some of the confidence and elegance of the previous generation. And few cars illustrate that trade-off better than the 1978-1987 Buick Regal, especially in its final form here. The 1987 Buick Regal Limited. To really understand this Regal, you have to understand what General Motors was trying to do in the late 1970s. Gasoline prices had become a serious concern, and GM's planners believed the future would demand much more efficient vehicles. On top of that, new corporate average fuel economy rules were forcing automakers to raise their fleet mileage numbers. So GM began shrinking its cars and preparing a much broader transition toward front-wheel drive. These rear-wheel drive intermediates were originally launched in 1978 as A-bodies, but by 1982 GM renamed the platform the G-body because the new front-wheel drive A-body cars were taking over the company's future plans. In many ways, the G-body wasn't supposed to live as long as it did. It was almost a holdover from an older era, one that kept surviving even as GM pushed the rest of its lineup toward front-wheel drive. And yet, despite all of that, the Regal kept selling. In fact, even in its final year, Buick still moved roughly 100,000 Regals, which says a lot about how appealing this car remained. Buyers still wanted a handsome, personal luxury coupe with rear-wheel drive, a formal roofline, and unmistakably Buick styling. And of course, the platform's legend was helped by the Grand National and GNX, which gave the G-body Regal performance credibility far beyond what most ordinary mid-size coupes could dream of. But even without turbochargers and blacked-out menace, the standard Regal still had something people liked. Now, the first-year 1978 Regal had one styling feature that many enthusiasts still criticize: the single rectangular headlamp on each side. It made the car look cheaper and less upscale than the Regal it replaced, almost as if GM's designers had been told to strip away a bit too much. The proportions were okay, but the face lacked presence. Fortunately, Buick fixed that fairly quickly. By 1980, the Regal adopted quad headlamps, and the transformation was immediate. Suddenly, the car looked more complete, more upscale, and much more like a proper Buick. By the time we get to the 1987 Regal Limited, that front end is one of the car's strongest features. The nose is dominated by Buick's trademark waterfall grille, a styling theme that had been part of Buick identity for decades, and here was reinterpreted in a much thinner, more vertical form. The grille gives the Regal a distinct brand face, and it works especially well with the low hood and gently rising fenders. There's a subtle elegance to the way the front end is shaped, low at the nose, rising toward the cowl, and then flowing into a relatively flat belt line before tapering off toward the rear. That tapering at both ends is especially important because it reflects the influence of Bill Mitchell, GM's legendary design chief whose taste for long, tapered forms shaped much of General Motors' styling in the 1960s and 70s. Even though Mitchell had retired long before 1987, the Regal still carried visual DNA from the era he helped define. That said, the Regal's design wasn't perfect. In side profile, the G-body platform reveals one of its biggest weaknesses: proportion. The 108.1-inch wheelbase just doesn't quite give the car the stance it wants. The overhangs look a little too long. The wheels don't seem pushed out far enough to the corners, and the dash-to-axle proportion is much shorter than on some of GM's best personal luxury cars. Cars like the 1969 Pontiac Grand Prix had a dramatic long hood, short deck look that gave them instant presence. The Regal, by comparison, feels a bit constrained by its packaging. The side profile is arguably the weakest angle of the car, especially because the thick, formal roof and large opera-style rear quarter window make the body feel taller and heavier than it really is. Still, Buick's designers worked hard to give the Regal some visual identity. The large quarter window, the upright formal C-pillar, and the gently swelling rear wheel arches all help create a sense of upscale character. The formal roofline also linked the Regal to Buick's broader luxury image. And it's no coincidence that GM carried similar roofline themes into many of its front-wheel drive cars later in the decade. Unlike Ford, which made a dramatic break with cars like the Taurus, GM often tried to preserve familiar rear-wheel drive styling cues: upright rooflines, formal proportions, and traditional three-box shapes, even as the mechanical layout underneath was changing. At the rear, the Regal continues Buick tradition with wall-to-wall tail lamps, another Buick hallmark that had been part of the brand's identity since the early 1960s. The rear design also echoes the front in interesting ways. There's a slight waterfall feel in the deck lid and tail treatment, with a concave section that helps slim the rear visually and create a little more depth. The bumper dips inward around the license plate area, adding another layer of shape and helping avoid a completely flat, slab-like tail. It's not the most dramatic rear end GM ever produced, but it does a good job of tying the Regal into Buick's family design language. One of the more interesting details on these cars has less to do with styling and more to do with how GM built them. On some G-body Regals, you can actually see a slight mismatch in paint tone between the fenders and the doors. That wasn't necessarily a repair or a mistake after the fact. It could have happened at the factory. That's because these cars came from a period when Fisher Body still handled much of the body construction, trim, and paintwork before the finished body was sent over to the final assembly side, where other components like fenders and the front clip could be painted and installed separately. So in some cases, different panels were effectively painted in different facilities, or at least in different parts of the production process, which explains why a car might leave the factory with subtle shade differences. Inside, the 1987 Regal Limited is an interesting mix of sport and comfort. This particular car has bucket seats and a center console, which initially suggests something a little more driver-focused, but under the hood, it's not especially sporty. The interior itself reflects GM's broader 1980s strategy of sharing more and more components across divisions. The light switch, HVAC controls, radio layout, and general dash structure all feel familiar if you've spent time in other GM products of the era. That commonality saved money, but it also meant individual brands had less opportunity to create truly unique dashboards and switchgear. Still, Buick gave the Regal enough soft trim and upscale touches to maintain its identity. The seats are especially telling. They use the loose cushion style upper backrest design that GM had popularized in the 1970s, particularly on upscale Oldsmobiles, Buicks, and Cadillacs. It was a look associated with comfort and luxury, even if the bottom cushions weren't truly separate in the same way. It gave the interior a softer, more plush personality, which fit the Regal's mission perfectly. The dash itself is very upright and vertical, but it's also laid out with some real thought. The passenger side is pushed slightly forward to create a feeling of openness, while the radio and climate controls are pulled rearward for easier reach from the driver's seat. It's a subtle ergonomic trick, but it shows that by the 1980s, GM was paying more attention to how drivers actually interacted with their cars. Under the hood, this particular Regal Limited is pretty modest. It carries Buick's 3.8-liter V6, producing about 110 horsepower and 190 lb-ft of torque. By modern standards, and even by 1987 standards, that's not much for a car of this size. It was the pre-3800 version of Buick's V6, and while it was decent enough, it wasn't yet the famously durable, ultra-smooth powerhouse that the later 3800 series engines would become. It could do the job, but it wasn't especially refined and certainly wasn't exciting. Optional buyers could step up to the 307 cubic inch 5.0-liter V8, which offered around 140 horsepower and a smoother, quieter driving experience, though still not a lot of real performance. Of course, the engine that transformed the Regal's reputation was the turbocharged 3.8-liter V6 found in the performance models. In turbo form, output jumped to around 245 horsepower and 355 lb-ft of torque, turning the Regal from a pleasant personal luxury coupe into one of the most fearsome American performance cars of the 1980s. That huge leap in output is part of what made the Grand National and GNX so legendary. But this particular Limited isn't one of those monsters. It's the quieter, softer side of the Regal story. The version bought by people who wanted style, comfort, air conditioning, and traditional Buick character more than outright speed. And maybe that's what makes the 1987 Regal Limited so interesting. It represents the final chapter of Buick's rear-wheel drive, personal luxury, coupe formula. Before the brand fully embraced the front-wheel drive future, it still carries old-school Buick cues. The waterfall grille. Thanks for watching.